Welcome. We might have more attendees joining later. The name of this session is the United States Space Economy Report 2012-2021, and our speaker today is Tina Highfield. She is a research economist at U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, and I would like to give the floor to Tina.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for having me today. I look forward to talking to you about a presentation and project that I've been working on at the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis for the past couple of years, where we measure the U.S. space economy. So I'll just start with a brief overview of BEA statistics in case you aren't familiar with the statistics that we produce. And then I'll talk a little bit about the methodology we use to estimate the US space economy. And then I'll talk about the actual statistics. So we have a nice time series from 2012 to 2021 that describes the total US space economy and the industries that contribute and things like that. So I'll go into a little bit of detail. And then I'll talk a little bit about next steps for the project and some future research. I'll note that I'm going to give an overview today, of course, but we do have information online on our website, which is listed on the last slide, including more detailed methodology documents, data tables, and things like that, in case you're interested in learning more. So if you're not familiar with the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA, we produce many of the macroeconomic statistics for the United States. So GDP is our most well-known statistic, but we produce many others, including trade statistics, information on employment, and things like that. So the way that when we talk about measuring the economy, we're talking about production of goods and services. And so I have here a chart from a recent press release that shows a percent change in real GDP by industry. Real just means it's adjusted for inflation, and we'll talk about that a little later in the context of the space economy. But I wanted to give you some idea of what we're talking about when we measure the economy. So we're looking at industries like healthcare, retail trade, agriculture, and we're looking at movement in production of goods and services in a specific time period. So we have the GDP statistics, and then we have underlying statistics as well. So one of the ways that we measure GDP is with input-output tables or make-use tables. And I have a snippet here from, this is 2012 data. This is the most recent data we have online, but of course in-house we do have more recent data. But I wanted to start focusing on the space economy at this point. So what I have on the left-hand side are the four major industries that make up the aerospace sector in the US economy. So aircraft manufacturing, aircraft engines, parts, and then guided missiles and space vehicle manufacturing. So we have the industries on the left-hand side, and then we have the products that these industries make. So I have in a rectangle, the orange rectangle on the very far right, we have guided missile and space vehicle manufacturing products. And so the main takeaway from this chart here is that guided missiles and space vehicle manufacturing products are mostly made by that industry, but they're also made by the aircraft manufacturing industry as well. And so the idea is when we're measuring the overall economy, we're measuring the products that are made, and then we're tracking which industries make them. So when we're talking about the space economy, what we do is we start with the input-output tables. So we measure the space economy the same way we measure the overall economy. So we go through the input-output tables and we find the products that are relevant to the space economy. And then that's how that's kind of the basic overview of how we measure the space economy. So what do we mean when we say the space economy? We have three criteria that we came up with, and this is based on past research, most notably from the OECD, but other groups as well. We did a lot of, this took a lot of time to come up with these three criteria. So we consider the space economy goods and services that are used in space or directly support those used in space. So this is things, the obvious things like space vehicles, satellites, launch pads, insurance. So that would be one of the supporting services. The second criteria is goods and services that require direct input from space to function. So this is things like GPS transmitters or GNSS equipment, satellite telecommunications, and things like that. And then the third criteria is goods and services associated with studying space. So R&D is the big one here, but we also include things like planetariums, observatories, and educational services. So if you're getting a PhD in astronautical engineering, for example, we would include that production in the space economy statistics. So as you can see, these are products that are basically directly related to space. And this chart here shows the major components of the space economy. So on the left-hand side, we have in orange the major industries, and then right next to them, these are the products that these industries make. And again, these come from our input-output tables that I was talking about earlier. So I won't go through all of these, but I'll start at the top to give you some example. So when we're talking about manufacturing, this is space vehicles, satellites, PNT equipment. And the reason why we have manufacturing, wholesale trade, and retail trade together is because these are all related in terms of measuring how a product moves through the supply chain. So if you think about, let's say you're buying a satellite dish for your house or for your RV or something, you're probably going to buy that at a retail store, so like a Best Buy or Amazon. Amazon would most likely purchase that satellite or satellite dish from a wholesale trade distributor. So these are businesses whose sole purpose is to move products. And the wholesaler gets that from the manufacturer. And so that's kind of why those three industries are grouped together, because that moves a product through the supply chain to the final user. I'll go down to information, the information sector. This is another large sector in the space economy. Telecommunications and broadcasting are the big products that this industry makes. So satellite television is the main one, but there's also satellite telecommunications for backhaul, satellite phones, satellite internet, and also remote sensing software is included in the information sector. Government is a large part of the space economy as well. And there's obviously, Space Force, but there's other, not just the Department of Defense, but non-defense industries, NASA, of course, and then there's federally funded research and development centers like JPL out in California. And so the way we measure government, because it's not traded in the market, is we use government spending. So this would be like the budget of Space Force and NASA. So those are the main ones. There are others, of course, professional business services, construction, and I'll talk a little bit about how these contribute to the space economy in a second. The last thing I'll note on this slide is on the right-hand side, I have the data sources that we use to estimate the space economy portion of these components. So I mentioned, within the input-output tables, we have products, and we decide what products are part of the space economy, but sometimes those products include both space and non-space activity. So the example of the guided missiles and space vehicle manufacturing, we don't want to include that entire value because most guided missiles don't go into space. We just want the part that goes into space. And so we use budget information to isolate that. And so on the right-hand side here, these are the different data sources we use in combination with our input-output tables to isolate just space activity. And I know I went over that pretty quickly, but as I mentioned, we do have more detailed methodology documents on our website if you're interested. So now I'll talk about the results. Hopefully you understand what I mean when I'm talking about the space economy. It's production of space-related goods and services. So we have a few different metrics that we publish as part of our space economy estimates. The first is gross output. Gross output is very similar to revenue or sales. And then we also have GDP. So GDP, or value added, is essentially gross output minus intermediate inputs used to production. So as I mentioned, gross output similar to revenue. So, you know, space, a satellite manufacturer sells a satellite, that's their gross output or revenue. Their value added is going to be the gross output minus the cost of the inputs they use. So the screws that they bought, the metal that they bought to create these satellites. And the idea with the value added is that it removes the double counting that's inherent in these revenue. If you just add up all revenue for all companies, you're going to be double counting because of those intermediate inputs. We do highlight gross output in our space economy statistics because we know that most of the private space economy reports are show revenue. And so revenue is, as I said, similar to gross output. And so we highlight this statistic because it's our understanding that our space data users are more familiar with what gross output means. So what I have here is a table from our 2021 statistics. These are our most recent data year available. And what this says is the space economy contributed $212 billion to the overall US economy. Between 2020 and 2021, gross output grew by 3.9%. Underneath gross output, we have what's called real gross output. As I mentioned earlier, that means that we've held prices constant. So we remove the impact of inflation. You may have heard in the news, you know, in recent years that inflation has been a big part of the economy. And what this statistic is showing is real gross output growth was actually negative 0.4. So when you compare gross output and real gross output here, the main takeaway is that the growth from 2020 to 2021, that 3.9%, that's mostly, that's going to be an increase in prices, not an actual increase in production of goods and services. And just to give some context, I have here the information on the total US economy growth over that period. So gross output grew by 13.2% overall. But when we adjust for inflation, growth was cut basically in half or more, 6.2%. So inflation impacted the overall economy and really impacted the space economy as well. And this chart shows the entire time series that we have available for the space economy statistics, so 2012 to 2021. And again, I have in blue is the space economy growth over that period. This is the average growth. And then the US growth for context. And so I wanted to show this because when you're just looking at the 2021 data, inflation is a huge part of growth. When you look at the overall series, it's not as big of a drag on the space economy. So gross output grew by 1.8% on average over the period. When you adjust for inflation, it's 1.2%. And the other takeaway from this slide is that the space economy versus the overall US economy has grown relatively slower. And so I'll talk about why in this chart. So in this chart, we have the full time series of gross output by industry. And this is by the major industries that I went over in a couple charts earlier. So if you just focus on the very bottom, the dark blue, this is manufacturing gross output. In 2021, manufacturing overtook information as the largest industry in the space economy in terms of gross output. For the entire series before that, it was the information sector. And so what's happening is it's not that manufacturing is necessarily growing, it's that information is shrinking. And so if you look at the light blue, the information bars, you can see that the information sector peaked in 2015. And this is mostly related to satellite television. So satellite TV in the United States peaked in 2015, and then it started to decline. And that's because of a couple things. The main thing is that internet started to become more prevalent, high-speed internet in rural areas. And rural areas are where satellite dishes are more prevalent because that's the only way that folks could get, like cable TV. And so once broadband started going out to these rural areas, folks who had to have satellite TV started to switch over and started to, use internet-based streaming services and television services. And we've seen this kind of continue since 2015. So you can see that number has been steadily shrinking. So that's kind of what's happening with those two biggest sectors. Within manufacturing, I'll note that there's two main areas of manufacturing. And again, it's kind of stayed flat because again, gross output is similar to revenue. And we've seen that revenue has stayed flat, not because there's not an increase in production, but because prices of producing things have gotten a lot cheaper over the period. If you think about space vehicles, satellites, launch, there's been a lot of innovation in manufacturing over the period. Things like 3D printing, reusable rockets, things like that. And so we see it's actually very interesting to note that although total output has kind of stayed pretty level, we're seeing more things being developed and produced, but they're cheaper. And so the impact on gross output is kind of this flat time series. Government is the next largest industry in terms of gross output. A lot of this is NASA, but it's also, as I mentioned, there's Space Force. Space Force started at the end of 2019, but of course there was a precursor to Space Force within the United States Air Force and other military branches. And we've seen the budget increase in the last couple of years related to government. So their share of the space economy has grown. The last thing I'll mention is wholesale trade. I said earlier, wholesale trade, the main product of wholesale trade is to distribute goods. They move goods from the manufacturer to other manufacturers or retail trade, stores or things like that. And this is a big part of the space economy, mostly because of the prevalence of GPS and GNSS equipment that's in a lot of the goods that we use. So your car has a GPS transmitter, your phone, ATMs do, etc. And so these transmitters are distributed through wholesalers. And so because of this, prevalence of these transmitters in the goods that we use, wholesale trade is a big part of the space economy. So I'll just focus here on the last 3 years of gross output for major sectors, and this is real gross output. So again, real means that we're holding prices constant. So we're removing the impact of inflation. And one of the main takeaways here is, if you look at 2019, you can see that manufacturing grew by almost 10%. So this is at the actual production of goods and services. This does not include prices. And so this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that we're seeing within manufacturing before COVID hit, there was this big increase in things being produced. Because we don't have prices in here, which were declining at the time, we're seeing this large growth rate. Government also increased spending as well. In light blue, this is the information sector, and you can see for the last 3 years where we have data that growth is negative, but there's a contraction. And again, it's satellite TV, people cutting the cord, and also prices are increasing. Even though there are less people watching satellite television, prices are increasing. And so we see that information is really kind of a big drag on the space economy because of satellite television. So I've talked a little bit about the major sectors. I kind of aggregated them into things like manufacturing and information just to make it easier to understand. But I have here a screenshot of the data that we have online. These are Excel spreadsheets, and there is more detail than I went through in my summary slides. If you're interested, please check out our website. We have these tables online. They're, like I said, it's an Excel spreadsheet, easy to download if you're interested. So I'll talk a little bit about next steps. So we do have more industry detail than I went over. So I just showed you this chart here. This is the level of detail that we have available. But we also, this is still pretty aggregated relative to our other statistics we publish. And so we want to put out more detail, more industry detail to allow researchers and policymakers to really understand what are the industries contributing to the space economy, how has that changed over time, and things like that. And so that's one of our goals for the next publication, which should be early next year. We're also collaborating with a few other agencies and organizations who are interested in measuring the space economy internationally. And so I've recently started collaborations with the European Space Agency and Eurostat, which is the statistical agency in Europe, to come up with their own European space economy statistics. And this would be a great thing because their statistics would then be comparable to the US statistics. So we'd be able to be comparing similar things. If you're familiar at all with private industry reports from the Space Foundation or Satellite Industry Association or NSR, Eurostat, Euroconsult, there are these different organizations that measure the space economy, but they use different methods, they cover different areas, and so you can't really compare the reports. So it's hard to know which number to use, which growth rate to use. And so for something like the BEA's US space economy statistics, when the Europeans come up with their own statistics, we won't have that issue. Because we're measuring the same thing, we'll be able to compare the statistics and know that we're looking at similar products. The other things we're exploring are state level statistics. So we have national level statistics now. Of course, people are interested in how does the space economy contribute to their own economy. So we are, the main thing here is getting source data. Having data at the US level, total national level is typically easier than the state level. And so that's kind of that's why we're exploring these statistics now to see if this is something we could do accurately. Another thing that's more related to research are satellite manufacturing price indexes. So price indexes are, this is a calculation we use to control for inflation. And the idea is you want to be measuring satellite production over the time period where you're comparing similar things. And so, if the price of a satellite increases because there's an improvement to that satellite, then we don't consider that inflation. We consider that a new product essentially. And similarly, if a satellite decreases in price because of an innovation, we also want to take that into account so that we can remove the impact of inflation so that we're tracking similar products over time. And so satellites, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of innovations going on within satellites that we just want to make sure that we are, capturing these innovations in our statistics. And the last thing I'll note is we're interested, based on feedback from our data users, in estimating gross output in addition to industry, like I just talked about, like manufacturing information, but by activity as well. So I have here a couple snippets from private industry reports, which from Space Foundation, Satellite Industry Association, on how they think about the space economy and how their statistics are presented. So on the left-hand side, Satellite Industry Association, they categorize the space economy and satellite economy by services, ground equipment, manufacturing, launch. We realize that these types of activities are more salient to our data users, and so we're looking at ways to possibly reorganize the statistics in a way that would be maybe more usable or more you know, where our space data users are more comfortable thinking about the data in those ways. So that's one of our major goals for future research in this area. So I'll just stop by showing some information on our website. We have these nice infographics, we have our data tables, methodology documents, and things like that. And then I also have the space economy at BEA.gov email if you're interested. If you have feedback or questions, this email comes directly to me. I'm happy to answer any questions you have or receive any feedback. So I will just stop there to see if there are any questions, and I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you. I know it's early, so it's fine if there are no questions. And I'll just note again that we at BEA, with these statistics, we are always interested in hearing from our data users. If there's other things that we could be thinking about, I had a list of future research, but if there's things that we missed, you know, please let us know. And I'm, you know, there's no questions now, that's fine. But if there are questions after the fact, please do feel free to reach out.
Okay, we have one question, I think. Have you thought about a method to account for products sourced from off-Earth? It's a Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Scott. So this is a good question. This is something that we have thought about, and it's a little tricky because when we're talking about measuring the US economy, typically that means things that are manufactured in the United States. And so if these are sourced from off-Earth, you know, there can be some confusion there. And so the way that we're thinking about it is whether or not it's a US company. And so US companies, I mean, this is kind of already happening in terms of R&D. There's R&D happening in space by US companies. And that is actually captured in our space statistics. As long as the company is when they're filling out their government reports, and that's how we measure the data. There's government surveys and tax data and things like that. If they are, if they note that this is space-related production, even if it's happening in space, then we do account for that. But it is, it can get a little tricky with things that, like in the International Space Station, where there are different countries involved. And so that is something that we're thinking about. It's not what we're doing now with International Space Station, because we're using government budgets. It's pretty easy to say, okay, we're going to count the US budget here. But I think this is something that is definitely on our radar to make sure that as this continues to happen more and more, that we are accounting for it, you know, accurately. But thank you for that question.
Okay, I think if there are no more questions, we're going to end this session. Thank you, Tina, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you everybody for joining. We have more panels going on until 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. So please check our program if you're interested. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Oksana. Bye-bye.